Imagine this. Under the icy skies of the Baltic, far from the warmth of southern lands, a group of warrior monks set out on a mission that would change the course of Eastern Europe. Wrapped in heavy cloaks, their breath turning to mist in the frigid air, these men were both soldiers and servants of faith. They called themselves the Teutonic Knights. Their story begins with a promise. After years spent caring for the sick and wounded in the Holy Land during the Crusades, these knights saw their dreams of Jerusalem slip away, but instead of fading into history, they set their sights north, to lands filled with deep forests, frozen lakes, and people who still followed their own ancient beliefs. The Teutonic Knights arrived in the Baltic with a single purpose: to bring Christianity to its last pagan corners. But their methods were not gentle. They believed that faith could be won by the sword, and their black and white crosses soon became a symbol that inspired both hope and fear. But here's what's truly fascinating. Behind the armor and the banners, these knights were not just conquerors. They built hospitals and towns, planted fields, and learned the languages of new lands. Some even became friends with the very people they were sent to convert. Yet every step forward brought difficult choices. Could their ideals survive the harsh realities of conquest? Was it possible to save souls without losing their own humanity along the way? Today, we journey deep into the saga of the Teutonic Knights, a story where devotion and ambition clash on snowy battlefields, and where every victory leaves its mark on the soul. If you are someone who loves uncovering the mysteries of great empires and the people who shaped them, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives, and join us as we explore the stories behind the cross and the sword. Let's discover the truth together. Did you know? The Teutonic Knights once built a castle so massive that its walls could hold entire villages during times of war. Some of these castles, like Malbork in Poland, still stand today, silent witnesses to centuries of history, waiting for us to unlock their secrets. Picture this. It's the year 1200, and Jerusalem has just fallen back into Muslim hands. The dream of the Holy Land, that sacred mission that had driven thousands of knights eastward, was crumbling like sand through their fingers. But among the chaos and defeat, one group refused to simply pack up and go home. The Teutonic Knights had started as something completely different from what they would become. Originally, they were hospital brothers, tending to sick and wounded German pilgrims in the Holy City. Their white cloaks bore a simple black cross, and their days were spent in prayer and healing, not warfare. But when the Crusader kingdoms began to collapse, these monk healers faced a choice that would reshape the entire map of Eastern Europe. Hermann von Salza, their Grand Master, was a man who could see beyond the immediate disaster. While other crusading orders clung desperately to their last strongholds in the Middle East, Hermann looked north, toward the vast wilderness of the Baltic region. There, beyond the borders of Christian Europe, lay untold millions of souls who had never heard the gospel. The Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians still worshipped their ancient gods in sacred groves, still practiced rituals that seemed demonic to medieval Christian eyes. But here's where the story gets fascinating. Hermann didn't just see a missionary opportunity. He saw something far more ambitious. What if they could build an entire Christian state from scratch? What if they could combine conquest with conversion, creating a new kind of crusade that wouldn't depend on distant Jerusalem? The transformation was remarkable. These former hospital brothers began recruiting heavily from the German nobility, promising adventure, salvation, and land to younger sons who had no inheritance waiting at home. They developed a military machine unlike anything Europe had seen before. Every knight was both a warrior and a monk, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet trained to kill with ruthless efficiency. Their castles became fortified monasteries where morning prayers were followed by weapons training. They pioneered new techniques in siege warfare, particularly suited to the dense forests and harsh winters of the north. But perhaps most importantly, they created an ideology that would justify almost any action. They weren't just conquering land, they were saving souls. This is where that haunting question emerges. Were they truly warriors of God? Or were they conquistadors who used faith as a convenient excuse? The answer isn't simple, because in many ways they were both simultaneously. A Teutonic knight genuinely believed he was doing God's work when he burned a pagan village, even as he calculated how much tax revenue that same village might generate once rebuilt as a Christian settlement. What made them so effective and so terrifying was this complete fusion of spiritual conviction and military pragmatism. They could justify the most brutal tactics because they saw themselves as instruments of divine will. Every conquered tribe wasn't just adding territory to their state, it was adding souls to heaven's kingdom. And here's a detail that shows just how seriously they took this dual nature. Their grand masters weren't chosen based on noble birth or military skill alone. They had to be accomplished in both warfare and theology, able to debate scripture with bishops, and plan military campaigns with equal expertise. They were creating something entirely new in medieval Europe, a state run by warrior monks who answered to no earthly king, only to God and the Pope. Hermann von Salza wasn't your typical medieval knight. While most warriors of his era could barely write their own names, Hermann was fluent in Latin, German, and Italian. He could quote Augustine and Aquinas as easily as he could plan a siege. But what made him truly extraordinary wasn't his education. It was his ability to see the world like a chess master, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Picture Hermann in his private chambers at Marienburg Castle, surrounded by maps and correspondence from across Europe. Letters from the Pope promising spiritual rewards, messages from the Holy Roman Emperor offering political support, reports from his field commanders describing the latest battles against pagan tribes. This wasn't just a religious leader or a military commander. This was a medieval CEO, running what was essentially a multinational corporation of conquest. Here's what makes Hermann's story so compelling. He genuinely believed he was saving souls, even as he calculated the most efficient ways to acquire territory and wealth. When he negotiated with Pope Honorius III for special privileges, Hermann wasn't just seeking power for its own sake. He was building the infrastructure for what he saw as the greatest missionary project in Christian history. But the methods he chose reveal the complexity of his character. Hermann pioneered what we might call conversion by intimidation. His strategy was simple yet chilling. Make resistance so costly that surrender seemed like divine mercy. When pagan tribes refused to convert, Hermann's forces would systematically destroy their sacred groves, burn their villages, and relocate entire populations. Yet after each campaign, he would personally oversee the construction of churches and schools in the conquered territories. One incident perfectly captures this duality. In 1226, Hermann received word that a newly converted Prussian chief had secretly returned to worshiping his old gods. Rather than simply executing the man, Hermann traveled personally to meet with him. He spent hours in theological debate, genuinely trying to convince the chief that Christianity offered a better path. When persuasion failed, however, Hermann ordered the chief's execution, but he also established a school in the man's village and arranged for the chief's children to receive a Christian education in Germany. Hermann's correspondence with Emperor Frederick II reveals another fascinating aspect of his personality. These 2 brilliant men developed what could only be called a friendship. Despite Frederick's reputation for skepticism about religious matters, they would exchange letters about philosophy, military tactics, and statecraft. Frederick once wrote to Hermann, "You fight with sword and scripture both, my friend. I wonder sometimes which weapon serves you better." The Grand Master's response has survived in the archives. "The sword opens the door, Your Majesty, but only scripture can change the heart. Yet I confess, there are nights when I wonder if we open too many doors with steel." This private doubt makes Hermann far more human than the typical medieval chronicle would suggest. His personal letters reveal a man wrestling with the moral weight of his actions. He established hospitals and schools throughout Prussia, personally funded the translation of religious texts into local languages, and insisted that converted pagans be treated as equals within the order's territories. Yet he also authorized campaigns that displaced thousands of families and erased centuries of local culture. Perhaps the most telling detail about Hermann's character comes from his final years. As he aged, he spent increasing amounts of time in prayer and study, seeking what he called the balance between justice and mercy. He established strict rules about treatment of prisoners and insisted that his knights learn local languages to better communicate with converted populations. Some historians suggest he was trying to atone for earlier brutalities, while others argue he was simply refining his methods of control. The question that haunted Hermann, and should haunt us, is whether noble intentions can justify questionable means. Hermann genuinely believed that temporary suffering in this world was a small price to pay for eternal salvation in the next. But believing something deeply doesn't make it right, and Hermann seemed to understand this tension better than many of his contemporaries. In his final letter to the Pope, written just months before his death, Hermann wrote words that echo across the centuries. "I have brought the light of Christ to dark lands, yet I fear I may have cast shadows of my own making. History will judge whether the souls saved outweigh the lives disrupted. That judgment, 800 years later, remains remarkably difficult to render." April 5th, 1242. The morning mist hung over Lake Peipus like a burial shroud, and beneath that mist, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The Teutonic Knights had been riding high on decades of victories, their black crosses striking fear across the Baltic. They had conquered Prussia, crushed the Lithuanians, and now they set their sights on something far more ambitious, Orthodox Russia itself. But they were about to meet a man who would teach them that confidence without wisdom is just another word for catastrophe. Alexander Nevsky was only 22 years old, yet he already carried the weight of Russian hopes on his shoulders. While the Teutonic Knights saw him as just another local prince to be swept aside, Nevsky had been studying their tactics for years. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and most importantly, he understood something they had forgotten. The land itself could be a weapon. The knights approached the frozen lake with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having truly lost. Picture their formation: heavy cavalry in the center, crossbowmen on the flanks, their warhorses' breath creating clouds in the bitter air. They had perhaps 700 mounted knights plus infantry support, and their leader, a man named Hermann, believed they were marching toward another inevitable victory. What they didn't realize was that Nevsky had been preparing this moment for months. He had studied the lake, understood its currents, knew exactly where the ice was thickest, and where it remained treacherously thin despite the winter freeze. Russian fishermen had been providing him with detailed intelligence about ice conditions, information that would prove more valuable than any spy network. As the knights formed their traditional wedge formation, something they called the pig's head, Nevsky made a decision that revealed his tactical genius. Instead of meeting them head-on, he positioned his forces in a crescent formation, with his weakest troops in the center and his strongest warriors on the flanks. To the knights, it looked like the Russians were offering them an easy breakthrough. The battle began exactly as the knights expected. Their heavy cavalry smashed into the Russian center, scattering lightly armed infantry like leaves in a storm. For a few minutes, it seemed like another routine Teutonic victory was unfolding. The knights pressed forward, their momentum carrying them deeper onto the ice, chasing what appeared to be a retreating enemy. But Nevsky was playing a much deeper game. As the knights pushed forward, his hidden reserves began closing in from both sides. Russian heavy cavalry, supported by dismounted warriors, began squeezing the Germanic formation like a vice. The knights suddenly found themselves not pursuing a broken enemy, but trapped in the center of an expertly planned encirclement. And then the lake began to speak. The ice, stressed by the weight of hundreds of armored men and horses, began to crack and groan. Some historians debate whether this was pure coincidence, or whether Nevsky had deliberately lured the knights onto the weakest section of the frozen surface. What's undeniable is that the sound of breaking ice became the soundtrack to a military disaster. Here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its imagery. Knights in full armor, who had dominated battlefields across Europe, found themselves struggling helplessly in frigid water. The very equipment that made them invincible on land became anchors dragging them to the bottom of the lake. Horses, trained for war but not for swimming in ice water, thrashed desperately before disappearing beneath the surface. But perhaps the most haunting detail comes from Russian chronicles, which describe how some knights, realizing their situation was hopeless, began removing their helmets and praying rather than fighting. These were men who had convinced themselves they were doing God's work, and now they faced the possibility that God himself was drowning them in a frozen Russian lake. Nevsky, watching from the shore, allegedly said words that have echoed through Russian history. "He who comes to us with a sword shall perish by the sword." But according to some accounts, he also ordered his men to try rescuing drowning knights who had surrendered, suggesting that even in victory, he understood the human cost of warfare. The aftermath was devastating for the Teutonic Order. They lost not just a battle, but their aura of invincibility. More importantly, they lost their dream of conquering Orthodox Russia. The defeat at Lake Peipus marked the easternmost expansion of their empire, a border that would hold for centuries. But here's the question that makes this story so compelling. Was this simply a case of tactical brilliance, overcoming military overconfidence? Or was there something deeper at work? The knights had been so successful for so long that they had begun to see themselves as truly invincible, chosen by God for perpetual victory. Their defeat on the ice forced them to confront a troubling possibility. Maybe their cause wasn't as righteous as they believed. Russian chroniclers certainly saw divine intervention in the battle's outcome. They described the ice breaking as God's judgment on invaders who presumed to conquer in his name. But even German sources began questioning whether the order had grown too proud, too confident in their own righteousness. The battle on ice became more than just a military defeat. It became a moment of reckoning that would shadow the Teutonic Knights for the rest of their existence, a reminder that even the most faithful warriors remain terrifyingly, beautifully human. Did you know that the Teutonic Knights created their own state, ruling as uncrowned kings? If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel. And tell us in the comments, do you think faith justifies war? By the early 1400s, something fundamental had changed in the Teutonic state. The warrior monks who had once slept on straw mattresses and shared simple meals now dined on silver plates in grand halls. The crosses on their chests remained the same, but the hearts beneath them had been gradually transformed by decades of wealth and power. Picture a Prussian peasant in 1405, watching a procession of Teutonic officials ride through his village. These weren't the humble hospital brothers of Hermann von Salza's era. These were lords draped in fine cloth, their horses adorned with expensive tack, their retinues including personal servants and luxury goods that would have scandalized the order's founders. The transformation was so complete that visiting dignitaries from other parts of Europe often forgot they were dealing with a religious order at all. The irony was heartbreaking. The order had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in creating a powerful state, but in doing so, they had lost the very soul that justified their existence. They still held their daily prayers, still wore their religious habits under their armor, but their actions increasingly resembled those of any other greedy nobility, rather than servants of God. The warning signs had been there for decades. Local populations, even those who had converted to Christianity, began viewing the knights not as spiritual guides but as foreign oppressors. The order's tax collectors became more feared than their missionaries were beloved. In some regions, peasants would hide their grain and livestock when they heard that Teutonic officials were approaching, treating them like raiders rather than protectors. What made this transformation particularly tragic was that many individual knights still genuinely believed in their mission. Brother Heinrich von Plauen, for instance, spent his personal wealth building schools and hospitals, yet he served under a grand master who used church funds to finance personal luxuries. The contradiction was tearing the order apart from within. The breaking point came with their treatment of the Lithuanians. When Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania converted to Christianity and married the Polish Queen Jadwiga in 1386, the Teutonic Knights should have celebrated. After all, their stated mission was to spread Christianity in the Baltic region. Instead, they refused to acknowledge Jogaila's conversion, claiming it was political theater rather than genuine faith. Why? Because acknowledging Lithuania as a Christian nation would have eliminated their legal justification for continued warfare and expansion. The order had become so dependent on conquest for their wealth and power that they couldn't afford peace, even when peace represented the fulfillment of their original religious mission. This decision revealed how completely the order had lost its way. They were literally rejecting the success of their own crusade because that success threatened their political interests. The warrior monks had somehow convinced themselves that their earthly kingdom mattered more than the heavenly one they claimed to serve. The alliance between Poland and Lithuania created a formidable enemy, but even more dangerous was the moral weakness that corruption had bred within the Teutonic ranks. When the great confrontation finally came at Grunwald on July 15, 1410, the knights discovered that their spiritual decay had infected their military capabilities as well. The battle itself was a masterpiece of medieval warfare, but not for the reasons the knights had hoped. King Władysław Jagiełło of Poland and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania had assembled perhaps 30,000 men, one of the largest armies ever fielded in Eastern Europe. Facing them were roughly 27,000 Teutonic forces, including elite knights, mercenaries, and allied troops. But numbers alone don't explain what happened next. The Teutonic Knights, who had once fought with the desperate courage of men convinced they were doing God's work, now fought like nobles protecting their estates. Their famous discipline had been eroded by decades of comfortable living. Their tactical innovations had stagnated because success had made them overconfident. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, meanwhile, fought with the fierce determination of people defending their homeland against foreign oppression. They had united Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and even some still pagan tribes in a common cause against Teutonic domination. In a bitter twist of history, the defenders of religious diversity had become more unified than the supposedly unified knights. When Grand Master Jungingen fell in the battle, struck down while trying to rally his retreating forces, it marked more than just a military defeat. It symbolized the death of an ideal that had already been rotting from within. The man who died that day wasn't the simple monk warrior that Hermann von Salza had been, but a political leader whose religious vows had become little more than ceremonial decoration. The aftermath of Grunwald revealed just how hollow the order had become. Rather than accepting their defeat as a divine judgment and reforming their ways, they immediately began plotting revenge and seeking political alliances to restore their power. They had learned nothing from their catastrophe because they had forgotten how to examine their own consciences. Perhaps the most telling detail comes from the letters written by surviving knights after the battle. Instead of spiritual reflection or calls for reform, most focused on practical concerns: how to rebuild their army, how to recover lost territories, how to maintain their political influence. The language of faith had been almost entirely replaced by the language of statecraft. The Battle of Grunwald didn't destroy the Teutonic Order overnight, but it shattered the illusion that had sustained them. They could no longer pretend that their cause was purely religious when their actions were so obviously political. The peasants they governed, the nobles they negotiated with, and even their own members could see that the warrior monks had become something their founders never intended. Just another grasping medieval dynasty, distinguished mainly by their religious costumes. The cross they wore had become heavier than the crown they sought, and under that weight, both their earthly kingdom and their heavenly mission began to crumble. The last Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights in Prussia, Albert of Brandenburg, made a decision in 1525 that would have horrified Hermann von Salza. He converted to Protestantism, dissolved the religious order, married, and transformed their sacred state into his personal duchy. The warrior monks who had once taken vows of celibacy and poverty had literally become what they had always been in danger of becoming: just another noble family ruling over conquered territories. But perhaps Albert's transformation was simply the honest acknowledgement of what had happened long before. The Teutonic Knights had created something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a state that blended religious authority with political power so completely that separating the two had become impossible. Their legacy isn't just about medieval history. It's about a pattern of human behavior that keeps repeating across cultures and centuries. Walk through the streets of Gdansk or Riga today, and you'll see the lasting impact of Teutonic rule everywhere. The Gothic architecture, the urban planning, the legal traditions, even the local languages carry traces of their influence. They built cities that still thrive, established trade networks that connected Northern Europe to the wider world, and created administrative systems that outlasted their own order by centuries. Yet this same legacy includes darker elements that we can't ignore. The Teutonic conquest involved the systematic destruction of local cultures, forced conversions that often existed only on paper, and the creation of social hierarchies that privileged German settlers over native populations. They pioneered techniques of cultural dominance that would be repeated by colonial powers around the world. What makes their story particularly relevant today is how they solved the problem of justifying conquest. Every expanding power faces the same challenge. How do you convince your own people, and ideally your victims, that your aggression is actually righteous? The Teutonic Knights developed an almost perfect solution by genuinely believing their own propaganda. This wasn't cynical manipulation, though that would have been easier to understand and counter. The truly dangerous aspect of the Teutonic model was that most knights really did believe they were saving souls, spreading civilization, and doing God's work. Their sincerity made them more effective conquerors and more resistant to moral arguments from their critics. Consider how this pattern echoes through history. Colonial powers convinced themselves they were bringing civilization to primitive peoples. Revolutionary movements have justified terrible acts as necessary for creating a better world. Even in our own time, we see nations and groups that wage war while genuinely believing they're defending freedom, spreading democracy, or protecting their way of life. The Teutonic Knights teach us that good intentions don't automatically produce good outcomes. They also show us how quickly a genuinely religious mission can be corrupted by the practical demands of maintaining power. The order began with men who were willing to die for their faith, and evolved into an institution more concerned with preserving its wealth and influence than with serving its stated spiritual goals. But there's another side to their legacy that deserves recognition. The Teutonic Knights also demonstrated something remarkable about human potential. They showed that people can create complex, lasting institutions that outlive their founders. They proved that dedication to an ideal, even a flawed one, can accomplish things that seem impossible. Their educational system, for instance, was centuries ahead of its time. They established schools not just for the children of nobles, but for talented youngsters from all social backgrounds. Many of the region's first universities were founded under Teutonic influence. They preserved and copied thousands of manuscripts, maintaining libraries that kept classical knowledge alive during turbulent times. Their agricultural innovations transformed the Baltic region. They introduced new farming techniques, established systematic land management, and created drainage systems that are still visible today. Entire forests were cleared and settled in organized patterns that maximized both productivity and defense. The landscape itself became a monument to their organizational abilities. Perhaps most impressively, they created a multi-ethnic society that, while certainly hierarchical and often unfair, still managed to function for centuries. Germans, Poles, Lithuanians, Prussians, and dozens of smaller ethnic groups all found ways to coexist within the Teutonic system. Their legal codes, though favoring Christians over pagans and Germans over locals, still provided more consistent justice than most medieval societies offered. The question their legacy poses isn't whether they were heroes or villains, but whether it's possible to pursue grand ambitions without losing sight of fundamental human values. The Teutonic Knights began with a genuine desire to serve others and ended up serving primarily themselves. They started as a solution to suffering and became, in many ways, a cause of it. This transformation didn't happen overnight or through any single dramatic decision. It occurred through countless small compromises, each one justified by circumstances, each one making the next compromise easier. The Knights convinced themselves that temporary harshness was necessary for long-term good, that political power was essential for spiritual mission, that their own survival mattered more than abstract principles. Their story reminds us to be suspicious of our own righteousness, especially when that righteousness seems to require harming others. It suggests that the most dangerous people might not be those who knowingly do evil, but those who do evil while convinced they're doing good. The Teutonic Knights left us magnificent castles, thriving cities, and rich cultural traditions. They also left us a warning about how noble ideals can be corrupted by human ambition. Both parts of that legacy deserve our attention, because understanding them might help us recognize similar patterns in our own world. After all, we still live in an age of competing ideologies, each claiming moral superiority. We still see nations and movements that justify their actions through appeals to higher purposes. The specific beliefs may have changed, but the underlying human dynamics that created and destroyed the Teutonic Order remain remarkably constant. Their story doesn't provide easy answers, but it does offer valuable questions. How do we pursue important goals without losing our moral compass? How do we maintain idealism while acknowledging human fallibility? How do we build institutions that serve their stated purposes rather than just perpetuating themselves? These questions mattered in medieval Prussia, and they matter just as much today. The Teutonic Knights were men of iron in a world of ice and fire, and their story carries a truth that echoes across the centuries. They began as healers who became warriors, as monks who became rulers, as servants of God who ultimately served themselves. Their black crosses, once symbols of sacrifice and service, became banners of conquest that cast shadows across northern Europe for generations. What makes their tale so haunting is that it wasn't a story of evil men doing evil things. It was the story of good men, sincere men, devout men who gradually lost their way. They never stopped praying, never abandoned their religious rituals, never ceased believing they were the heroes of their own story. Yet somewhere between the hospital beds of Jerusalem and the throne rooms of Prussia, their noble calling transformed into something they would barely have recognized. Hermann von Salza died believing he was building God's kingdom on earth. The knights who fell at Grunwald thought they were dying for a sacred cause. Even Albert of Brandenburg, who finally dissolved the order, probably convinced himself he was adapting to serve a higher purpose. The tragedy isn't that they became monsters overnight, but that they became something monstrous so gradually that they never noticed the transformation. Their castles still stand today, magnificent stone testaments to human ambition and engineering skill. Walk through Malbork or Marienburg, and you can almost hear the echoes of their prayers mixing with the clang of their weapons. These weren't simple fortresses. They were complex communities where warriors and monks, craftsmen and scholars, German settlers and local converts all lived together in an experiment that was both inspiring and deeply flawed. The Teutonic Knights remind us that the line between heroism and tragedy is often thinner than we'd like to believe. They show us that the most dangerous corruption isn't the kind that announces itself with obvious evil, but the kind that wears the mask of righteousness. When faith becomes a weapon and the cross becomes a banner of conquest, even the most noble knights can lose their souls while believing they're saving others. But their story also teaches us something hopeful, that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they dedicate themselves to purposes larger than their own comfort. The schools they built, the cities they founded, the knowledge they preserved, the administrative systems they created, all of these outlasted their military conquests and contributed to the development of European civilization. Perhaps that's the most important lesson the Teutonic Knights offer us. They succeeded brilliantly at many things they weren't even trying to accomplish, while frequently failing at their stated mission. They wanted to save souls, but ended up building nations. They sought to serve God, but created enduring human institutions. They dreamed of heavenly rewards, but left behind very earthly legacies. Their history reminds us to examine our own motivations, to question our own righteousness, and to remember that good intentions require constant vigilance to avoid becoming something else entirely. In a world that still sees conflicts justified through appeals to higher purposes, the Teutonic Knights remain remarkably relevant teachers. They were men of their time, shaped by medieval assumptions about faith, war, and civilization that we no longer share. Yet the human struggles they embodied, the tension between ideals and reality, the corruption that can follow success, the difficulty of maintaining moral clarity while wielding power, these remain as current as tomorrow's headlines. The Black Cross of the Teutonic Knights has faded from the battlefields of Europe, but the questions their story raises continue to challenge us. How do we pursue noble goals without losing our way? How do we build institutions that serve their stated purposes, rather than just perpetuating themselves? How do we recognize when our righteousness has become self-righteousness? These questions mattered in the forests of Prussia 800 years ago, and they matter just as much in our interconnected world today. The Teutonic Knights may be gone, but their story, With all its glory and tragedy, its achievements and failures, its inspiration and its warnings, remains vibrantly, urgently alive. If you've enjoyed diving into this complex chapter of medieval history, there are countless other stories waiting to be explored. The Middle Ages were filled with fascinating characters, dramatic events, and timeless human dilemmas that continue to resonate today. Each tale offers its own insights into how people have struggled with questions of faith, power, justice, and meaning across the centuries. The past has so much to teach us, but only if we're willing to listen with both admiration and critical thinking, celebrating human achievements while learning from human failures. The Teutonic Knights, in all their contradictory complexity, remind us that history isn't just about what happened long ago. It's about understanding the patterns that continue to shape our world today. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel for more content about the Middle Ages. See you in the next video.